After 6 years of dating, my boyfriend broke up with me when his first love returned. I cried my heart out, made a scene, and in the end he threw me out of his mansion. Grant Maxwell frowned at me and said, "Don't lose your dignity like this." I turned my head, tears in my eyes, almost bursting into laughter. Finally, I got rid of this fool. 1. Back at the suburban villa bought with Grant's money, my friend Marissa called me. "Come to the Greenfield Bar, second floor private room." I lay on the bed. "I'm exhausted, not going." "So early and you're staying home? What are you doing?" "Got dumped, counting my money." Marissa nearly spat out her drink and finally said, "You should come even more now that you got dumped. Troy Maxwell is back." I immediately perked up. My first love is back too. 2. Pushing open the door to the private room, I walked in with tousled soft curls, a dreamy chiffon blouse, paired with a long skirt and flip-flops, looking drowsy. Someone greeted me with a look of amazement, but I walked straight to Marissa and complained, "I told you I was about to sleep. I even removed my makeup, and you still called me out." Marissa almost gagged at my pretentious act, suppressing her laughter. "Lydia Page, look who's here." I squinted in Troy's direction and whispered, "I didn't wear my contact lenses." I leaned in, and the man in the booth tilted his head to look at me, exhaling a puff of smoke. I widened my eyes, fanning the smoke away, and blurted out, "Troy." His long lashes cast a shadow on his face as he politely nodded. "Hello, sister-in-law." 3. Troy and Grant are brothers. You can tell they have different mothers just by their names. Troy is the eldest son of the Maxwell family, while Grant rose to prominence later. Years ago, Troy and I were the perfect couple since our school days, but after an accident, rumors spread that Grant and I were involved, and there was no way to clear our names. Later, Grant's first love got so mad she left the country, and 4 years passed without a word. Troy also took over the family business overseas and left. To maintain appearances, Grant and I lived together for many years, keeping up a facade for the public. This second young master was foolish enough to think that after all this time, I had fallen for him. Nonsense. Troy blocked all my contact methods, so he could only hear about me through his brother. I used every trick in the book to make him believe Grant and I were madly in love. I pushed for 4 years until the recent news of our engagement finally brought him back. He sure is stubborn. Hearing him speak like that, I didn't hold back. Leaning forward, the low neckline of my chiffon blouse nearly revealed too much as I smiled sweetly. "Hello, brother." Troy, always the picture of a cold gentleman, straightened up, his eyes turning red from the smoke. He was still as slim and upright as ever, with broad shoulders and narrow hips, perfectly proportioned, his angry expression adding to his allure. "Brother, it's great you're back. Grant and I had some issues before the engagement. Now that you're here, maybe you could talk some sense into him? We're not kids anymore. It's time to drop the whole true love act." I tilted my head, speaking softly to Troy, but our conversation was cut short by someone singing. I tucked my hair behind my ear, gave him an apologetic look, and returned to my seat. 4. The night breeze was slightly chilly. I stood at the corner in my light clothing, shivering as I lit a cigarette. Suddenly, I felt warmth on my shoulders as footsteps approached from behind. I lowered the cigarette, squinting with a smile. "Brother." "Shut up." Someone snapped at me angrily. "So easy to provoke?" Just then the others came out as well, and Marissa, walking over, exclaimed, "Damn, Grant's really doing this?" Caught on camera late at night picking up some woman from the airport, hugging her, even carrying her luggage. Is the news breaking now because they couldn't agree on a price? Or did he just let the story slip on purpose? Seeing the content on Marissa's phone, my smile faded a bit. Over the years, as Grant's rumored girlfriend and later fiancé, this kind of news hit me the hardest. Everyone around me was gossiping, and I felt a bit down, forgetting to light my cigarette. Nearby, a tall, slim man chuckled coldly. "Looks like you won't be sister-in-law after all. Calling him brother all the time, what a waste, huh? What a sharp tongue. Just like before." His car roared past me, low-key yet arrogant, stirring up a cold wind that made me shiver even more. "Screw you, Troy." I hugged my shoulders, tears welling up in anger. 5. My family has been in the fabric business for generations, passed down from mother to daughter. Coincidentally, the Maxwell family is a fashion industry giant, with top-tier brands making it internationally. Given the connections from previous generations, it was natural for talks of marriage to arise in our generation. But some things touched on the issue of inheritance. On my side, I didn't want to take over my mother's business and wanted to study design instead. On the other side, Troy had been pushed out of the family business, with his stepmother and brother gaining favor with the Maxwell patriarch. The year I graduated, full of ambition, I went home and told my mother about my plans in Troy's name. She fainted on the spot and was rushed to the hospital. That summer, a rift grew between Troy and me. He was the one who suggested breaking up. Your mother's illness was triggered by me. Now you want to let the family skills die out and ruin such a big partnership with the Maxwell family. Lydia, you might not blame me now, but one day you'll regret your decision. I laughed angrily. Am I some kind of breeding sow? Do I need to find a different boar just to ensure the piglets have a good future? Troy had just graduated back then with no solid footing. He looked at me like I was a child, pale-faced, and smiled faintly. Lydia, you're thinking too little. Later, the scandal between Grant and me broke out. I didn't know if this was orchestrated by the Maxwells or if my mother had a hand in it. After all, she was the one who called me to dinner with the Maxwells that night. Before that, I thought my father divorced her simply because he loved freedom. I never imagined she could be so controlling and overbearing. Her illness requires annual checkups, and the replacement parts aren't a permanent fix. She can't afford to get upset. So I've lived these years feeling utterly suffocated. Now that Troy has finally cooled down and returned, he's still making me mad. But it's fine. Troy and I are unlucky, not blessed by fate, but that doesn't mean others are following the wishes of those in power. Grant's first love is an artist, a genius type, proud and aloof. After she left in anger, Grant was so upset that he started drinking daily and hasn't touched me since. When the child gets upset, the adults have to deal with the headache. And with me constantly expressing my love for him, Grant genuinely wants to strangle me every time he sees me. TSK. I'm not having a good time, so no one else should either. As I lay on the bed, fuming with anger, Grant called, his voice cold. About Fiona, you're coming with me to explain to the Maxwell family. 6. I've had enough of coaxing him. I laughed out loud. In your dreams. Hung up. Blocked. All in one smooth motion. The floor of the Maxwell family shrine is hard. Let's see how the second young master likes kneeling on it. The next morning when I woke up, my mom called, asking me to come over and interview a few masters. Her tone was as cold and commanding as always, as if she was completely unaware of last night's events. As I applied my lipstick, I said, "Not today, Mom. I have plans." She paused for a moment. "Who are you meeting? Just cancel it." In her world, I only have two choices: listen to her or listen to her. I blended the edges of my lipstick and smiled. I really have to go. My mom took a deep breath and started lecturing me, methodical and indifferent, every word hitting where it hurts. Anyone with a bit of pride would be stung, but I'm used to it. When she realized I wasn't responding, I heard the sound of water being flushed through the receiver. She said, "You can't keep a man you don't care about your career, you're such a disappointment," and then hung up. Trying to provoke me? In the past, I would fall for it every time, but my darling is back now. Nothing can stop me. By the time I arrived at the mountain villa, it was already dusk. In the courtyard halfway up the mountain, a few people were preparing dinner, while others, fresh from the hot springs, were lounging in deck chairs, sipping tea and enjoying the evening breeze. When they saw me, they all looked stunned. I was all smiles, dressed to the nines, but they had all heard about Grant being whipped and punished by the old man last night, kneeling in the shrine all night long. By all rights, I shouldn't be so happy, but I couldn't help it. Troy also came over in a bathrobe, fresh from the hot springs, his hair still damp, looking quite charming. The moment he saw me, his eyes narrowed like a hawk's, then he glanced away and went to grab some food. I approached him deliberately. "Brother, your brother got beaten up yesterday. Did he come to you for a heart-to-heart?" Troy picked up a glass of fruit wine and looked at me. "Who said we were close? For years ago, I remember you two were fine. When my girlfriend became his fiancée, things went downhill," he said coolly. A strange sweetness welled up inside me, and I leaned closer, eagerly saying, "How about I call off the engagement with him and we get back together?" The setting sun cast a fragmented light in my eyes, It should have looked beautiful, but Troy's expression changed several times before he laughed, his chest shaking slightly. You're the one getting dumped, Lydia. It's Grant who wants to break off the engagement, not you. Do I look like someone who picks up other people's trash? I was stung. But I reached out and poked the bit of skin showing on his chest. It's not picking up trash, it's returning what's rightfully yours. He grabbed my hand coldly. Did you forget? I have a cleanliness fetish. 7. Right. This jerk has a cleanliness fetish. In our last year of college, we rented a place together for convenience during our internships. I could live in a dump, but Troy couldn't. He cleaned until it was almost dark, and no matter how I posed on the bed, he wouldn't look at me. Finally, he told me, there must be no hygiene dead zones in the house from now on. At first, I was thrilled by the word house coming from his mouth, my heart racing. But no hygiene dead zones? Kill me now. I jumped on him, covering his face and neck with lipstick marks, and said, I'm the biggest hygiene dead zone here, so kick me out. Troy was both angry and embarrassed but could only let me do as I pleased. Young love. Every time I think of it, it makes me blush. Troy is the most disciplined and well-planned person, but when it comes to me, he loses all sense. This time, his words really crossed the line, and I sulked for a full 5 minutes. Marissa stumbled in from the doorway, saw me, and rushed over to ask, Why are you still here? Aren't you going to plead for Grant? The old man said he'll beat him to death if he doesn't apologize to you. I was indifferent. A bunch of thugs, their own kid misbehaves, and they want me to act all magnanimous, so in the end that idiot Grant will hate me. They get to play the good guys. I spat out a tomato peel. This time, I'm going to drive those old fools to their graves. Marissa was shocked. Is this a late rebellion, Lydia? I laughed bitterly. Back then, they broke us up, even made a guy who really liked me dump me, thinking I was made of clay with no temper. It's been so many years, it's time to settle the score. We kept playing until after 9 p.m. I was wrapped in a towel, flirting with some younger guys, and those who didn't know my identity actually took the bait. Until Troy walked over and said, Your fiancé's on the phone. I had blocked Grant, so he called his brother instead. The younger guy's face changed instantly, his gaze no longer daring to linger on my shoulders, and he raised his glass and walked away. I raised an eyebrow. Brother, are you jealous? He frowned. The call is still connected. I didn't care. Seeing Grant's number, I answered with a smile. Hello. Grant's hateful voice came from the other end. I will never apologize to her. Lydia, full of schemes, the one who drove a wedge between Fiona and me, the person I hate most is her. Lydia, we're definitely breaking off the engagement. You think you can use my family to pressure me? Just like 4 years ago? Dream on. Then came the sound of a whip. TSK, TSK, how violent, scary. The man beside me also frowned. All these years, he thought my relationship with Grant was good. He probably never expected it to be like this. I smiled and cursed. Screw you. You got caught cheating and now you're blaming me? Even after getting whipped, you still want me to clean up your mess? Your ego's bigger than the universe. You think I enjoyed having Fiona as the third wheel? Ha! You're only fit to be my ex. My outburst stunned everyone around me. Troy was also momentarily dazed, looking at me in the moonlight with a puzzled expression. Brother, it looks like tonight won't end well. I need to go to the Maxwell house. Can you drive me? Before leaving, Marissa seemed to sense something was off. She ran over, grabbed my arm, and said, Have you thought this through? Lydia, what are you really trying to do? In the past, when we drank and vented, I would always say I wanted to reconcile with Troy but didn't want to upset my mom. But my mom kept pushing and Troy might not forgive me. I always lamented how unlucky I was. Marissa sympathized with me but couldn't think of a better solution. Seeing me now, ready to burn all bridges, she was afraid I might do something drastic. My eyes reddened as I told her, I can't fight this alone. I need to win back my man first. 8. Half an hour later. On a lonely road deep in the mountains. Troy frowned as he tried to make a call for quite a while without getting through. Well, of course, right now they're probably gathered around a bonfire roasting a whole lamb. Who would answer the phone? I innocently rested my face on my hand, watching him from inside the car. Sorry, but I had already drained all the gas from the car and let the air out of the tires. I also slashed the spare tire with a big cut. Luckily, the car still had power, and the air conditioning was running on low. I sneezed as I said to Troy, "Brother, I'm going to close the windows now. There are too many mosquitoes and I've already got bitten all over. I'm afraid the AC will drain the battery if we leave it on." Troy hung up the phone with a cold expression, then went to the trunk to get some mosquito repellent for me. I turned around and said, "Could you help me apply it on my back? I just got bitten several times there." My hand, with its nude-colored nail polish, pointed to my upper back. Troy's gaze was intense, and I could see through the reflection that the veins on his eyelids were throbbing. He let out a cold laugh and said, "Who told you to wear a backless dress?" I wanted to show off more, but this was the most revealing outfit I could find at the moment. I turned my head, pouting, "Brother." His hand tightened into a fist and he said harshly, "Shut up," before opening the bottle and leaning in. Outside the car, the cicadas chirped incessantly, while inside, familiar American country music played. The atmosphere was too cozy. I suddenly grabbed Troy's hand and leaned into him, turning my head to look at him. "Troy, after all these years since our breakup, have you ever missed me?" 2 minutes later, I was standing outside the car, banging on the window in frustration. "Let me in. Do you really want me to stand here feeding the mosquitoes? The mosquitoes in the mountains could eat me alive, you know?" Troy. The handsome man's profile was stunning, cold and unchanged. He wiped the lipstick off the corner of his mouth, then turned to me and mouthed 3 words. "Shameless." I was stunned. Then I started banging on the window even harder. "What do I need shame for when chasing after you?" Yelling didn't work. The car's soundproofing was just too good. I ended up pressing myself against the window, my eyes reddening, and tears began to fall one by one. "I missed you so much." That pervert Grant humiliated me, thinking I was responsible for what happened. How could he ever compare to you? He's just flattering himself. For so many years I've lived like the evil supporting character in a trashy novel, and my true love misunderstood me. That incident wasn't real. You were the only one for me. That night, I arranged for him to. With a click, the door opened. Troy furrowed his brow and asked me in a low voice, "What did you say?" I looked at him and for a moment my brow twitched, and then I managed to escape from his hold, pointing to the corner of his mouth. "Brother, you didn't wipe it all off." Troy, realizing I had seen through his thoughts, wasn't angry for once. He leaned against the car door, a hint of helplessness in his expression. That posture made him even more attractive. "Get in. The mosquitoes are fierce out here." His voice was tinged with weariness as he spoke to me in a hoarse tone. I didn't play hard to get and got back in the car. Half an hour later, I wasn't sure who he contacted, but another car arrived. When I saw Damon get out of the car, I didn't think much of it at first, but suddenly, it felt like a string inside me was pulled tight. I hesitated before getting up and quickly glanced at Troy. The last time Damon and Troy stood together in front of me was back in our junior year of college. 9. In our junior year, Troy and I were on the same debate team, preparing for an international competition. We were staying at a prestigious university in the provincial capital. At that time, the Maxwell family was collaborating with that university on a project, and Damon, as the Maxwell family's butler, was busy managing the funding allocations. When he saw Troy and me attending the same meeting, he paused for a moment, politely finished the ribbon-cutting ceremony, and then approached me. "Brother Damon." Back then, Damon was extremely courteous to me. The tension between me and the Maxwell family hadn't escalated yet, so I was delighted to see him. Damon, however, smiled with his hands behind his back and glanced at Troy. "Is this your boyfriend?" I was taken aback. "What are you talking about? Troy is Mr. Maxwell's son. You know that better than I do, so why are you asking me?" I laughed so hard I nearly doubled over, my eyes darting between the two of them. At that time, Troy was still a reserved, elegant young man with a slender figure, showing a bit of youthful shyness compared to Damon, who was in his 30s. Damon chuckled and then pulled me aside to talk with Troy for about 10 minutes. When I returned with our debate coach, their conversation had already ended. That genius who dominated our school's debate arena and later the international stage clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Yet he remained calm and composed as he delivered his final words. "You've never cared about me before, so there's no need to start now. Unless she gives up, no one will make me let go." Back then, I didn't understand what he meant. Later, when my mom said she had arranged for me to meet the Maxwell family's son, I was actually excited. Until I met Grant, who was extremely cold and impatient with me. The eldest son's biological mother passed away when he was 5, and he didn't grow up in the Maxwell family. Otherwise, how could he have attended the same university as Miss Page? Grant attended only custom schools with custom curricula. Grant is the one Mr. Hu groomed to be his successor, Miss Page. You should understand that as soon as possible. At the time, I didn't care at all about Damon's explanation, thinking it was just a twist of fate. It wasn't about status or who was out of the other's league. It was simply fate playing tricks. As long as Troy and I were united, we were still the most perfect match. 10. So, when he broke up with me back then, I wasn't without grievances. In the subsequent times we had contact, I'd show off our relationship. When he came back, I would call him brother with every opportunity, but it was all just my selfish way of getting revenge. But Troy, from the beginning to the end, seemed to remain much calmer than I was. After the car broke down and we called for a tow truck, Troy and I arrived at the Maxwell family home. The car stopped. The hall was brightly lit, and I knew I had a tough battle ahead. I lifted my skirt and walked down the steps, straightening my back and walking steadily, both to avoid leaning on others and to overcome my own fear. Uncle Maxwell's face was ashen with anger, and he was holding a weapon. But upon seeing me, his gaze seemed to brighten as if he had found a savior. Who knew I ended up crying first? I didn't bother with appearances anymore, pretending to be strong. Naturally proud and unwilling to be manipulated by these two schemers, I had always put on a facade of being in control, afraid of being humiliated by Grant. This time I cried as much as I wanted. For someone who never cried, it was heart-wrenching to see me cry. As expected, everyone panicked and began blaming Grant. To him, I might seem like a woman who appeared tough but was actually fragile and pretentious. Grant's mother, seeing the situation was dire, went over and lightly slapped his shoulder. "Speak. Are you still going to keep in touch with that woman or not?" I guessed that, given Grant needed me to come back to the Maxwell family to explain, this news probably wasn't leaked by him but by Fiona, that little woman. Grant, feeling sorry for her after all these years of grievances, had borne the brunt even at the expense of his own reputation. Without my help, he had to face the storm from the Maxwell family alone. As a result, he was beaten and scolded severely, and his male pride collapsed for a moment, leading him to say things like, "I'd rather die than break up with Lydia." This situation only suited two people. One was Fiona, the other was me. But how could I let these two get their way? Just as the argument reached its peak, a tall figure walked in from the back, talking on the phone with his body turned sideways but his eyes on me. I knew this was Fiona's scheme, and I just needed to play along. It was obviously a play with no real emotions involved. Yet, I recalled those moments when, during the debate competition, my young man remained calm and composed, passing me strategies written on notes when we were faced with tricky arguments. "If I could be disgusted by you guys, I'd take your surname." After crying enough, I wiped my eyes and adopted an enlightened, despairing demeanor as I said, "Grant has indeed been wronged all these years. It was my insistence. He's blameless. If that's the case, I'll grant you your wishes. Let's call off the engagement." 11. The hall was in chaos. Old Mr. Maxwell, still trying to maintain some decorum, directly knocked Grant unconscious. Troy's stepmother also fainted from crying. To make things even more interesting, just when I thought the situation was already chaotic enough, a woman suddenly rushed in from outside, throwing herself over Grant and crying uncontrollably. It was Fiona. Perhaps she thought that her presence would prove their love was real, but I had never seen someone with worse judgment than her. She just added fuel to the fire, making the situation even more dramatic. No matter who tried to persuade them now, it was useless. I stormed out of the Hoare residence in anger. Halfway out, I realized the Maxwell family hadn't sent a car to take me home. This was probably their way of trying to keep me. I was momentarily stunned, thinking I had overlooked such a minor detail, which was rather amusing. Suddenly, two bright headlights slowly swept towards me. It turned out that Troy's phone call had been to send his car over. Even more heartwarming, someone was in that car. My best friend Marissa, with a worried expression. I held back the tears that suddenly welled up and got into the car after opening the door. On the road, aside from Marissa's mild complaints, the car was extremely quiet, even a bit suffocatingly cold. The silence was broken by a call from my mom. I had anticipated her call, but in front of Troy, perhaps because I was too nervous, I accidentally put it on speakerphone. So, everyone in the car could hear my mom's calm reprimands. "You used to be quite smart. What's with this tantrum now? She's a nobody and will never affect your interests, even if she has a child. How could she possibly impact your benefits? You didn't need to show up yourself. Let the Maxwell family handle it. There was no need for you to make a fool of yourself. Lydia, do you think you handled today's situation well?" Marissa's face changed dramatically, and she almost jumped up to grab the phone and talk to my mom. I stopped, realizing what was happening, and quickly pulled the phone away. I was indeed embarrassed. But not because of her reprimands. It was because the person I liked and my best friend were right here with me. So it doesn't matter if I'm embarrassed or not, or whether I'm happy or not. If I can exchange it for money or for your face, Ms. Nora, that's enough, isn't it, Mom? When my mom heard that, she laughed. "How old are you? Talking such childish nonsense? Why don't you go and have your brain reassembled?" In her view, marriage and such things were mostly unhappy. Nothing was more important than benefits. But she herself had created her own unhappy marriage, so why should she impose such cruelty on me? "If you're not stupid, then marry him, Ms. Nora. I'll hold a press conference to publicly announce the breakup another day." With that, I hung up. Marissa was stunned and only managed to say, "Your mom is so frustrating," before my phone rang again. It was a message from Grant's mother. A voice message. Indeed, when your own mother doesn't respect you, why should outsiders? After my mom's call, she went to apologize to the Maxwell family. "It was Lydia's fault. Please don't mind it. Tomorrow the European craftsmen are coming. Let's arrange a time to visit the factory." 12. For a moment I felt cold all over. My face was burning hot, a mix of ice and fire. I opened the window to let in some warm air and noise, and only then did my racing heartbeat gradually calm down. We arrived downstairs at my place. Marissa insisted on coming up with me, pulling at me. "Lydia." I knew what she was worried about. For years, I had been a clown in front of my mother. I had no doubt that if one day I were pushed to suicide, my mom would look at my body and say, "With such poor mental resilience, you could even commit such unfilial acts as suicide. You've lost all sense of decency. You're just a complete fool. Thank you for bringing me back, brother." I adjusted my mood, leaned against the car window and smiled at Troy. "Today isn't convenient, brother. I'll call you up another day." I was afraid that I might lose control. But the handsome man parked the car, unbuckled his seatbelt, and tossed the keys to Marissa. "If you're going to sit, do it now. I won't have time another day." I was still feeling a bit dazed as we went upstairs. When we entered the door, I was still trying to get my bearings. Looking down, I saw that he had already changed into the slippers I bought from a certain store and entered the house with familiar ease. The design here was based on the layout we used to enjoy together. An open balcony, tiled floors, heavy carpets, and floor-to-ceiling windows. There was even an ashtray on the small table with the label still on it. The bathroom had a full set of toiletries and couples' mugs. I felt extremely embarrassed, thinking that I had always imagined using these things after successfully getting him. Who would have thought he would come up today? He put his hands in his pockets, took a look around, and leaned against the sideboard, looking at me. "Housekeeping did this?" Realizing I had to face the situation, I said, "Yes, why? I've earned a lot of money myself." He smiled. As he smiled, the expression turned a bit desolate. He looked at me and asked, "What were you going to say in the car earlier? Are you really breaking up with Grant?" My heart pounded wildly. I understood this was an opportunity. If we could reconcile and resolve misunderstandings, tonight might be the best time. But for some reason, maybe because of my mom's call or because I hadn't completely ended the engagement, and all plans had yet to achieve their desired results, I couldn't bring myself to say a word. Moreover, I couldn't gauge Troy's feelings towards me at this moment. The engagement naturally needs to be called off. Otherwise, would I let others walk all over me just to accommodate my mother? My hands were shaking and maybe my voice was too. My eyes were warm and wet. I brewed a cup of oolong tea with some alcohol, hesitated, and looked at him. Brother, do you want some of this? It's what you used to like. Teen. What happened next is hard to describe. It was too intense. I had a bit of confidence, smiling seductively as I walked towards him, intending to tease him. But instead he eagerly came at me. His expression was stern, but his eyes were full of warmth. As I was about to speak, the words almost escaped my lips. Troy suddenly pulled me close, pressing me against the sideboard, his entire back blocking me. The strap of my luxurious dress had somehow tangled on the cup rack on top. As I moved, the rack toppled and wine glasses came crashing down towards my head. The wine spilled everywhere, and though we hadn't drunk any, we were both drunk. Tiny shards of glass embedded into my feet. Troy picked me up, and suddenly everything was topsy-turvy. I clung to his neck, my whole body trembling like a shrimp that had been scalded. The light was dim, and the room was filled with the smell of wine. He anxiously checked my wounds, his warm thumb moving from my thigh down to my calf, finding a few small cuts I hadn't even noticed. If it weren't for seeing his reddened ears, I would almost believe he was truly calm and composed. Suddenly, a torrential rain began outside. Troy and I were lost in a heated kiss on the sofa. Yet, he seemed to have remembered something, suddenly snapping back to reality as he looked at me in his arms. Troy, you're even more irresistible now than back then. I leaned in and whispered in his ear. He shivered all over. Troy then slowly took my hand, gradually creating distance between us. After a few deep breaths, he suppressed his emotions, his face shifting between red and pale. He buttoned up his shirt and solemnly said to me, "Lydia, I'm very sorry. Perhaps I wasn't ready either." After Troy helped clean up everything and left, I curled up on the sofa motionless. How could we reconcile so confusingly? I knew it was impossible. I actually understood Troy's predicament, and he knew mine. Over the years we had tortured each other, and the only lesson we learned was that in this world, love alone is not enough. 14. In college, because of my affluent background and attractive appearance, I was quite arrogant and unruly. Troy had shown remarkable talent in debate from his freshman year. Because I liked him, I fought my way into the same debate society as him with my sharp debating skills. From then on, I pursued him, he ran, and he couldn't escape. With his excellent looks and countless Best Debater awards, Troy attracted almost all the outstanding girls in the same circle. Yet, he never accepted any of them. The change occurred during my sophomore year. My parents had a fierce argument. Dad was usually the patient type. Every time they argued, he would tremble with anger, but eventually calmed down by the next day. He would still cook for me and take me to my tutoring classes. But this time, his face was red and white, showing an unprecedented fatigue, his shoulders sagging as if all his strength had been drained. He no longer looked at me, no longer told me to close my room door, and asked my mom to speak quietly during their arguments. After my mom had vented her emotions and broken things, he called housekeeping to clean up. Then he came to my room and said, "Lydia, you've grown up. You need to have your own opinions and take care of yourself." On the day he left home, he smiled and said, "Dad loves you," softly closed the door and never came back. During that week's campus competition, having learned of my parents' divorce, I felt like a wilted eggplant, no longer confident and flamboyant as before. I suddenly felt like I had no home. That was when Troy came to my side. He didn't try to comfort me but simply said, "Lydia, if you're willing, I'll always be here for you." He probably never confessed to anyone. The words were phrased differently. No one confessed like that. At least say I like you? But that day I ended up crying uncontrollably in his arms, and then I took his first kiss. His personality was quite like my father's, patient and tolerant. However, in areas he was good at and didn't want to be polite, he was equally sharp and uncompromising. Yet, it was also this kind of person. I ended up damaging his face later. Even though I had promised I could stand up to my mom in my junior year, when I drove my mom to the hospital in anger, Troy was there too. He comforted me softly, saying it was okay, that I was just trembling. I was like a Parkinson's patient, trembling from my lips to my fingers to my calves. A tremendous fear gripped me, and all that remained in my mind was my mother's cold and disgusted gaze. She was still slightly conscious before entering the operating room. I threw myself at her, crying, "Mom, I'll listen to you. Don't go, don't leave me. You're all I have left. I'll listen to everything you say from now on. Is that okay?" That time, Troy didn't come up to support me. He had seen how my mom controlled me, her comprehensive scolding and suppression, and the fear and compromise driven into my bones. So how could I face him, who had always kept his promises and stayed by my side no matter my emotions? Things went as I expected. Fiona's little scheme not only failed to tear apart my relationship with Grant, but also made the Maxwell family more hostile towards her. And Grant, after having his card stopped and cutting off outside contact for a few days, even agreed to apologize to me. "Lydia, stop making a scene." In the villa, Grant used the excuse that I had left a few paintings here. I checked and indeed found the ones I had forgotten on the small balcony. I wanted to annoy Fiona a bit, so I went to get them myself. Grant stood at the door, rubbing his forehead, speaking to me in a tone softer than I had ever heard from him. "Weren't you going to break up with me and go marry your true love?" I gave him a flirtatious wink and said. His face, which had started red and purple, finally turned a deep black. "Do you think everyone is like you? Only caring about status and benefits?" TSK. Even when trying to clear his love's name, he still couldn't resist taking a jab at me. What an idiot. He thought Fiona cared about his sincerity, but the truth was Fiona wanted what she couldn't have, and his sincerity, how much was it worth? A slight shake of his foundation, and he immediately turned to power and profit. This is why Fiona had to plan so slowly over the years. I wouldn't be so delusional as to think that these years of being a doormat meant Grant had fallen for me. I couldn't be bothered with him. I smiled and walked out. "Excuse me, thanks. Lydia, you don't have the face to make me completely give up Fiona. Don't be so naive." He threatened me from behind. Yes. Sure, take your Fiona, but don't let anyone snatch her away." I muttered a few curses at this idiot. As soon as I left the villa, I received a call from Marissa. Since the day we went to Maxwell's house, I hadn't had any contact with Troy. I added him on WeChat, but he hadn't accepted the request for a long time. I asked Marissa about it, and she said Troy had been quite busy lately, only interacting with people in his industry. I had to ask her to keep an eye on Troy's movements. After all, her brother was supposedly Troy's partner from back then. Marissa's voice was low and urgent. "Lydia, come quickly. There's a gathering at a guest house in the suburbs, and there's a woman you really don't like trying to seduce your man." 15. For a moment, I lost all interest in dealing with the Maxwell family. I asked Marissa for the address and hurried over. It turned out the gathering was just a mahjong game. In a guest house in the suburbs, surrounded by vast orchards that provided a serene view, several wealthy young men and their companions sat at a mahjong table. Their elegant hands delicately held the small golden mahjong tiles, their faces full of smiles. Troy stood behind a woman who was unrealistically beautiful, lightly touching her as he organized her tiles with his long, attractive fingers. "Bianca, if you can play, then play. If not, step aside and let someone else handle it," one person said with a smirk. Bianca glanced at the speaker and rolled her eyes. "Why do you care? You're the one who always messes up." Her harsh words were at odds with her pure, enduring beauty. Occasionally, when she threw a small tantrum, her eyes were captivating enough to draw people's gaze. The group laughed together. Even Troy leaned to one side, a faint smile at his lips. When Marissa saw me arrive, she quickly jumped up. "Lydia, quick. I'll give you my spot. I've lost thousands already." Troy seemed surprised to see me, looking up with a calm expression like a misty mountain. My heart skipped a beat as I sat down. Bianca wasn't originally from our circle. I knew she was the illegitimate daughter of a nouveau riche family. She wasn't raised with them but was brought in to be pampered only after the family's matriarch fell ill. Without the burden of taking over the family business, she had become a typical pampered princess in our circle. Fortunately, she didn't grow up too spoiled and became known for her genuine personality, making her quite popular. As I sat down, I was good at mahjong but kept making mistakes. "Haha, didn't you say she was good? She's my previous dealer, and she's feeding me tiles. She's too full." A woman with a loud mouth. I glanced over coldly. I didn't see her arrogant expression but saw Troy's corner of his mouth twitch slightly. The half-elegant, half-sly allure he exuded made my heart ache. Brother, it's strange. After that day, Uncle Maxwell didn't mention our engagement, but he did ask about you a few times, I said, pushing my tiles aside and looking at Troy. Did you not contact the Maxwell family after you came back? Why did Uncle Maxwell and Uncle Damon look so surprised when they saw you? The people around us showed some surprised expressions, some looking at Troy, others at me. Troy, while still organizing Bianca's tiles, replied, After all, it wasn't for them that I came back. I was still puzzled when Bianca, with a smile, chimed in, Yes, those things aren't worth Troy coming back for. So, she knew something I didn't? Seeing my expression, Bianca wickedly winked at Troy and reached out to me. Oh, I forgot to mention I went abroad with Troy before, just 2 years later. Thankfully, he helped me graduate from that awful course. I'm Bianca, you've heard of Miss Page, right? I had heard of her. At that moment I looked down and shot back. Mahjong is too dirty, don't spread infections. Bianca was stunned, unsure of how to respond, and began playing again in a daze. I played seriously, ensuring she didn't get anything good. Within 2 rounds she began regretting being my dealer, jumping up angrily. She keeps blocking my win. She knows what I'm drawing. You're targeting me, Lydia. Troy intervened, stopping her from making a scene. He lightly tapped her shoulder. On the mahjong table, everything is normal. Bianca wanted more but was silenced by his words. The game isn't decided until the end. Some seemingly hopeful tiles might not come through. Later, just as he said, I had a great hand but couldn't make a move. Meanwhile, Bianca, with a disordered hand, suddenly exclaimed, I won! Single tile. She arrogantly pointed at me and said, Lydia, you were the one who messed up my hand, right? Pay up triple for messing up my tiles. Let me see your tiles. What good are they if they're no use? Her words were so harsh that I felt like crying, my nose burning. I glanced at Troy, who looked as if he was deep in thought. I came to regain my dignity, not to find out that he had a new lover over the years. At that moment, all my hopes shattered. I called Marissa and went to her room alone. After washing my face with cold water for a few seconds, tears continued to flow freely in the icy water. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Lydia, is this the room you went into? His voice. Get lost. Why didn't you tell me you had a girlfriend? Do you think I'm happy to see you flirting with me? I don't need you to live, so stay away from me. I shouted through my sobs as the bathroom door was close. The knocking stopped for a moment. In the summer heat, the cicadas were deafening, and the few seconds of silence felt like a sponge soaked in sour water. After a while he chuckled softly. His voice softened. Open the door. This lock is broken. It's stuck inside and outside. I'm afraid you'll stay in there. Marissa's memory isn't reliable. I did remind her. Open the window, Lydia. I'll carry you out. 16. The scene when I came out was incredibly embarrassing. It was even more humiliating than when I forgot my lines during a drama performance in my junior year, having to improvise and heat up the atmosphere to a boiling point. I clambered down from the high window in an extremely awkward dress. Troy, looking serious, held my leg with one arm, wrapping the dress tightly to prevent exposure while blocking the view of the crowd below with his other arm. It was infuriating. They pointed and laughed, especially Bianca, whose laughter revealed all 18 of her teeth. I was foolish not to realize at that moment that if Bianca liked Troy, she shouldn't be laughing so happily. Leave. Your girlfriend won't be happy. As soon as I landed, regardless of my weakness and embarrassment, I immediately pushed him away. I still had some moral integrity. Troy, being so tall, was pushed back a bit by me. He frowned and eventually grabbed my wrist as I tried to leave. Lydia. His use of my name softened my heart, making me stand still, waiting for his explanation. Bianca is my cousin. 17. In my senior year, we had the provincial debate finals. The topic was whether helping others should come with a reward. Our stance was that it shouldn't, while the opposing side adamantly clung to the view that good deeds should be compensated, looking down on us with moral criticism. Troy, with his clear, serene face, stood up and asked the opposing team, if the other side doesn't want compensation, would you still withhold it? Can you live with that? The opposing team's articulate third speaker instantly turned red, stammered for 3 seconds, and avoided the topic. Throughout the entire match, the opposing team never answered our question. If they don't want it, would you still withhold it? From then on, it became a classic reference across the school. Troy always knew the core of the problem and cut straight to the heart of it. I abruptly turned my head. I had never heard or asked about Troy's mother's side of the family. I only knew he was from the wealthy Maxwell family and naturally, he should be living well, even though his mother had passed away from illness when she was 5. Troy pulled me to a quieter area inside, away from the mocking eyes of those below. The branches of fruit trees stretched into the third-floor corridor, carrying the sweet essence of summer, gently separating us. He stood close to me, just a hand's breadth away, and said, "She's my aunt's child, raised with me from a young age. When she learned about my difficulties abroad, she asked her father to let her come and pursue a degree. Her mother and my mother are sisters. My mother once persuaded her sister that being a mistress could never compare to being the legitimate wife, but my aunt didn't listen. But later, she became the legitimate wife but died of depression due to her husband's infidelity. My aunt and my mother had a relatively easy life. After Bianca's father and the other party parted ways amicably, he chose to be with his first love from over 10 years ago, even though they had nothing besides themselves. So it's hard to say what choices are right. There are too many things beyond one's control. But one thing you can control is to love her for a long time and not change." Troy rarely spoke so long. Even during debates, he was never the one to give the concluding summary. In our relationship, he was also quiet, always expressing himself through actions. I had countless questions but couldn't ask them all at once. My head buzzed and I only remembered the words, "Love her." I suddenly couldn't say anything, lowering my head as tears fell onto the hot floor. I reached for his hand. "The person you're talking about, who is she?" He smiled. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against mine, and said softly, "It's my Lydia." With others still waiting for us, we couldn't be overly affectionate. We only held hands and walked down, drawing wide-eyed stares from everyone. They frequently signaled Marissa. "What's going on?" Only Bianca, covering her mouth, sneaked a laugh. As she laughed, even her eyes began to glisten. At the guest house, we naturally picked fruits. The whole afternoon, no one went back to the rooms. We went to the orchard, then had a meal at a farmhouse. We set up a large iron pot to cook, wore rain boots, and caught lively crayfish. By the time the car drove back to the guest house along the remote path, it was already dark. Bianca and I used our phone flashlights to navigate the alley. She tilted her head and said, "I'm sorry for provoking you this afternoon. My brother was always in bad shape abroad. Every time he got back on track, he would be distracted by news from you, unable to eat or sleep. I almost had to go with him to see a therapist. Our situations are quite lamentable. My aunt married my uncle and it was a big deal in town. Who would have thought she died when my cousin was only 5? My cousin was sent back, and he grew up in my grandparents' small town all these years." In the dark, Bianca's eyes shone brightly. "At that time I was also in the town, but I had good food, nice clothes, and lived in a big house. My dad told me he and his wife were only together for practical reasons. It was clear that the aunt could do whatever she wanted as long as she didn't interfere with us. My dad visited me often and spent money on me, sending me to the best schools. But despite growing up with my cousin for over 10 years, I never saw my uncle visit once." Bianca turned her head. "Lydia, my brother always feels he's not good enough for you. All these years away from you, he's been working hard to be worthy of you. Unless one day you stop waiting for him otherwise." "No." Bianca shook her head. "There is no otherwise. He will keep waiting for you." 18. I had too many questions in my mind. When we reached the room, I washed my face absent-mindedly. Marissa sent me a message. "Are you going to make a move tonight?" I was so embarrassed, trembling as I replied, "Go away." When Troy returned after finishing his discussions, he saw me and placed his hand on the door, looking me up and down. In a deep voice he said, "There are other rooms next door. If you want to go there, I can help you arrange it. If you want to stay here, that's fine too." This man was so perfect, sometimes too reserved and gentlemanly. At that moment, I didn't dare reveal my own desires. I smiled through my tears. "You didn't tell me you grew up with your grandmother." "Yeah, So when you went to another province and met Uncle Damon, did he tell you to leave me? Yes. Troy, why didn't you tell me all this? These are problems I needed to solve. So you must not have left for overseas on your own accord, right? You said you took over the family's overseas business, but it couldn't have been that simple. I became agitated, overwhelmed by the many things beyond my imagination. I stepped forward and asked him, "What's really going on? What have you been doing all these years?" I often wondered, although Grant and Troy were brothers, there was still the issue of competition. How could someone like Grant, with such a nature, maintain a close relationship with his brother? Even sharing secrets he couldn't tell his own family. Turns out he never had any chance of competing with Grant. You will know. Troy came over and embraced me. He spoke gently, but this time he couldn't comfort me through my tears, which flowed like a waterfall. I said, "Rich kids are usually arrogant and overbearing. Who would be like Troy, so down to earth, relying only on his achievements?" The only precious spot for a top university recommendation was something he prepared for step by step from his freshman year. In the end, he never went. How many unknown factors were at play? I know some things I can't tell you. If I do, you'll overthink. Lydia, aren't I doing well now? What about you? Do you really not want to get married? If you say you don't want to, I'll help you. He leaned in and whispered almost inaudibly. I remembered a saying I'd heard somewhere. I've already walked 99 steps for you. Only that last small step remains. Are you willing to come towards me? I seemed to understand. Those struggles, coldness, and retorts when we first met were fears and carefulness about everything falling apart after taking those 99 steps. I wiped my tears, grabbed his hand, and pushed him down onto the bed. Like a queen, even with red eyes, I said imperiously. I said I don't like him. You're the one for me. 19. The next day my face was positively glowing. If Marissa hadn't insisted on waking me up, I might have been even more radiant. She kicked open my door and exclaimed, "Oh my God, what an eyesore! It's already noon and you're still in bed." Still retaining some dignity, I threw a pillow at her and said, "Marissa, do you know how to spell reserve?" Marissa jumped aside, giggling, and then said, "Get up and prepare for the storm. Your fiancé's little white lotus, TSK, is causing trouble." Instinctively, I grabbed my phone. Fiona had pulled a trick last time that angered the Maxwell family and made Grant's mother dislike her even more. She wouldn't dare cause any more trouble with Grant, so if it wasn't Grant, it must be me. Fiona had cried during a live stream of this morning's art exhibition. She had initially refused to discuss her private life, but under pressure from a bunch of reporters, she teared up and, choking back her sobs, said, "I was Grant's girlfriend back then. I know some things were unavoidable. I'll be careful and accept everyone's supervision." She bowed and didn't get up. What a fresh and pure lotus flower. Meanwhile, some photos suddenly went viral online, pictures of me from high school up to now, flirting with various men, implying that my family upbringing was questionable. I was initially fuming, but then I noticed that most of the men in those photos were actually Troy. I couldn't help but laugh. Troy brought breakfast from the guest house, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and asked, "Staying up late last night made you fiery? Let's not add chili to the rice noodles, okay?" I was lost in a photo. I reached out and wrapped my arms around his waist, asking, "When was this taken? I'm wearing a high school uniform, but I didn't meet you until college. Yet the tall, slim guy in the photo is clearly you." Troy stiffened, his gaze fixed on my phone. The photo seemed to be taken in a hospital. A girl in a school uniform with long hair was holding up a bloodied and dazed boy, his face blurry. His long fingers reached for my phone, and after examining the photo for a moment, he smiled. I don't remember clearly, but maybe we really did meet before. Troy scrolled through the news while I ate, his expression growing colder. He put down the phone and asked, "You've been living with these comments for years?" I slurped my seafood noodles contentedly. So what? It's not like it's my true love. It's all just acting. I'm not upset by the criticism. I trailed my toes up his pants leg. But if you ever have a scandal, just wait and see how I'll deal with you. Troy's ears turned red again. He held my icy foot and, after a moment, watched me finish the last noodle, suggestively asked, "Are you full?" I nearly choked. This incident caused quite a stir. My mom, of course, called me over a dozen times to scold me, but I didn't answer. Grant's mother texted, "Lydia, what's going on? How ironic. Her son and his first love haven't even been resolved yet. She's dirtying her own hands while demanding that I keep mine clean." In the end, my mom sent me a message. "Come home for dinner." 20. Considering that Troy and I had once caused her to be hospitalized 4 years ago, this time I only had Troy drop me off downstairs and didn't let him come up. I was almost running inside when a sudden wave of guilt surged and I ran back. "Troy, I'm sorry. 4 years ago, for his sake, I didn't dare to argue with my mom. For years later, I still had to hide him. It was truly embarrassing. But my mom, she has a pacemaker in her chest." Troy pinched my chin, gently turned my face towards him and kissed me, saying, "I know you have your plans. Otherwise, you wouldn't have endured for 4 years. At this crucial moment, if it weren't for that Jiang, I'd think you were just being considerate of me. Course it's for you." I thought this sentiment inside, and couldn't help but hug him and kiss him for a bit longer before heading upstairs. At the same time, even though I was allowed to go, I was still bitterly smiling inside. You see, it's my mom who's unreasonable. It's my mom who gives me no leeway or alternative options. Yet I always have to make Troy suffer, knowing full well that I'm unfair to him, but not knowing how long this unfairness will last. What right do I have to make him endure such suffering for my sake? Aunt Holly opened the door and politely invited me in for dinner. My mom, a refined lady, had hired a highly educated, reserved, and graceful nanny. She spoke in circles, never tearing her face with anyone. Her dominance was evident in every word and action. The table was set with my favorite dishes, and my mom personally served me. Such situations were rare. The first time was my 10th birthday when she and my dad, still on good terms, helped decorate. The second time was when I got into college. She hosted a grand feast, forcing me to show off my filial piety for appearances. This time, she wasn't scolding me but instead was polite and respectful. I felt a bit uneasy. Tomorrow, there's a dinner with the person in charge of the European outsourcing factory. He's Chinese. To open up foreign markets, we need to go through him. However, despite trying several times with your future mother-in-law, he's been unavailable. He's from Huada and your alumni. He's interested in debating competitions, and I remember you joined a debate club and even went to international competitions. So it was for work. Red wine was on the table. I picked it up, swirled it, and smiled. "Mom, each generation has its trends. I don't need to carry on the Qin family's legacy to be wealthy and successful. I've been following your ideals for so many years. When can I pursue my own?" "Tomorrow." I drank a whole glass and the alcohol hit me. I couldn't discern what my mom had said. My mom, with a calm demeanor, said, "The Maxwell family's marriage and our cooperation both need to be secured. I've given you enough freedom this time, right? So tomorrow, use that useless silver tongue of yours to secure this cooperation." I see. Even though I wasn't focused on the debate during college, Troy led me to truly enjoy it. My mom never supported my interests. Even if I made it to the international stage, it wasn't considered serious in her eyes. Okay. Fine. I wanted her approval so much. I drank a bottle of red wine that night, my eyes red and swollen. My mom took the wine away, gently advising me to sleep early. I cried heavily in her arms, thinking that if I succeeded in the negotiations tomorrow and met her expectations, I would bring Troy back to show her. I didn't expect our next meeting would be under such circumstances. Nor did I expect. I didn't cause her to be hospitalized. This time it was me who had danced on the edge of the abyss. The next day, Uncle Wesley brought the clothes I was supposed to wear. They were quite nice, revealing my shoulders and side legs. Seeing my excited, youthful appearance, Wesley hesitated, then smiled and said, "Lydia, you look beautiful." He liked my mom and had stayed by her side for years but never became her partner. I guessed he was probably the only one who could tolerate my mom's temperament. Feeling hopeful and in a good mood, I smiled and replied, "Thank you, Uncle Wesley." He took me to the car, directing traffic and occasionally glancing back at me, chatting warmly. Troy and I exchanged messages as we rode, and the warm atmosphere felt oddly familiar. The sunlight streamed through the car window, and I suddenly remembered which day it was familiar from. It was the day after Troy and I broke up. When I went to the dinner party, it was also Wesley who accompanied me. As I cried while texting Troy, he watched me, saying with a smile, "Young girls have plenty of time. Don't get too hung up on one person. People's instincts aren't always accurate." I smiled slightly, fighting against an unsettling feeling, and got out of the car. 21. Troy, what are you doing? Having a meal with someone. Which hotel? Cheshire. Oh. I'm here too. Which private room are you in? Lydia, over here. Troy's gentle voice came through the call. I turned and was pleasantly surprised to see him at the end of the corridor. As I was about to run to him with a smile, my mom emerged from the private room behind me. Where are you going? The guest will be arriving soon. For many years, her voice had an almost magical quality that made me freeze in place with just a few words. I turned back smiling and said, "Okay, I know. Your lips are dry again. Haven't you been drinking water? What's the use of using even the best foundation if you don't? Haven't I taught you social etiquette?" My mom lightly scolded me as she sat down, instructing the waiter to bring out a jug of corn juice. Sweet and refreshing, it was just what I needed. I was momentarily stunned but gulped it down. The change came when the door was knocked. My mom adjusted her clothes, stood up, and stopped the waiter. "I'll open it." She was unusually nervous. This person is strange. He doesn't appear in public, and with the media so advanced now, no one has seen the real face of this boss, which made it very hard for me to find him. I don't know what's going on. He hasn't met anyone for ages, but he agreed to meet today. It can be said that nothing happens without a sign. When my mom saw Troy's face, she was stunned for a moment. She glanced at me, then turned back to him, smiling faintly, and said, "Did I not make it clear 4 years ago, or was it last night? You have no future with my daughter. Even if you're shameless, this is too much. A regular university, an uncertain career, a family that doesn't acknowledge you, and 2 elderly people in your hometown who can't manage themselves. How do you have the face to appear in front of me for so many years? If you had any sense of decency, you wouldn't have come to ruin such an important occasion today. Lydia must be blind to be interested in you." 22. I was used to my mom's sarcasm, but Troy was not. 4 years ago? Last night? What was going on? I was trembling with anger, standing up with a pale face, and asked, "Mom, what happened last night?" She didn't reply. "What happened 4 years ago? When did you make it clear to him?" "I never knew." My mom, impatient, said, "The guest is about to arrive, Lydia. You need to explain it to him and get him out." I had been treated as less than human by my mom for years. I was her own daughter, dependent on her, and it was my lot to be used by her. But Troy was not. With tears in my eyes, I approached, but Troy grabbed my wrist. He walked in, closed the door, and said softly, "Sorry for being late, Ms. Nora." 23. Both my mom and I took a full minute to react. My usually decisive Ms. Nora was initially skeptical, staring at him coldly for a long time. Only when she made a call that rang in Troy's hand did her expression change dramatically. It was hard to describe the transformation on her face in that moment, like going through the vicissitudes of life, changing repeatedly, and finally settling into a faint, bitter smile as she sat down. What they talked about afterward I didn't listen to. My mind was buzzing with my mom's words about Troy. He could ignore it, continually soothing my arm, but I was shaking with anger, more ashamed and furious than when I had been scolded in front of Troy years ago. My mom was silent, but it didn't matter. Wesley Uncle was there to handle business or personal matters, speaking on my mom's behalf. Troy and Wesley Uncle were deep in conversation. It was my reaction that interrupted them. Troy noticed something was wrong with me. He stopped Wesley Uncle's words, placed his hand on my forehead, and pulled me into a tight embrace as I suddenly started shaking violently. He asked, "Why are you suddenly burning up so badly, Lydia?" I couldn't speak. Sweat was dripping from my forehead, and my whole body was too weak to move. The world spun around me, memories flooding back, and all the voices around me became bizarre shouts. I finally realized that this day was very similar to another day. The day Grant and I were set up. It was also a glass of corn juice, and it was poured by my mom. I had speculated for years who was behind that incident, blaming it on the scheming Maxwell family. I never expected it was her. It was just her. With the Maxwell marriage situation ruined beyond repair, I still needed to have some other value. Wesley's uncle seemed to be aware of this. He glanced at the grim-faced Ms. Nora and patted Troy's shoulder, saying, "Take her to the hospital. It's just a matter of sedatives. A few days of rest and she'll be fine." Troy's expression also changed. He stood stunned for a long time, holding me tightly, looking at my mom in disbelief. It was absurd. I didn't know where I got the strength from. I pushed Troy and Wesley's uncle away, ran to my mom, stared at her face, and while shouting, I grabbed the food from the plate and threw it at her face. "Calling you Mom? What do you take me for? For a person? Or a dog? I trusted you so much, never questioning you for years. I loved you and respected you, so I deserved to be used by you, didn't I?" For over 20 years, I had always been obedient and well-behaved, never speaking in such a hysterical manner. Like a madwoman. Yes, I was like a madwoman. I threw the teapot. Grabbing the porcelain shards, I screamed at her ear. "It's not only you who can force others. It's not only you who can die. I can die too." After a moment of darkness, I collapsed on the ground. Due to the effect of the medication, I felt no pain, only seeing my hands covered in blood, my face, neck, and arms covered in scratches I had made during my outburst. I seemed to be laughing crazily and loudly, and then crying like a child without a home. What brought me back to my senses was a hot, broad embrace. Amid the violent shaking, I saw his bloodied hand torn by the porcelain shards. Suddenly, I stopped being frantic and quietly curled up in his arms, letting him carry me away. "Troy, I'm sorry." Tears streamed down, and after all these years, I finally uttered this long overdue apology. 24. When I woke up again, it was only natural that I was lying in a hospital bed. Fortunately, as I had hoped, and likely due to Troy's intervention, no one came to see me. I didn't want anyone to see me in such a state. I didn't want to talk to anyone either. Not even Marissa. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Instinctively, I tried to turn to the side, only to realize my arms and upper body were immobilized, probably to prevent the wounds from reopening. I closed my eyes, feeling as if I were dead, until I heard a familiar voice. "Lydia." I opened my eyes. In front of me was Comrade Chin Yuan Shan, my father, who was deemed worthless by Ms. Nora and worked as a university teacher. I looked at him for a few seconds before tears started streaming down my face. My dad stumbled over, his eyes red, and embraced me gently, not daring to hold me too tightly. He comforted me in a trembling voice and eventually couldn't help but cry along with me. "Lydia, I'm sorry. Dad is sorry for you. Dad should have taken you with him." My dad remarried a year after his divorce from my mom, to a divorced female teacher from the same school. He had a gentle personality and did well in academic research, so he was never short of admirers. But once a woman is married, she often has her own selfish interests. Whenever I visited my dad, his new wife, with her large belly and her son, would show some displeasure if she happened to see me with him. After that, my dad stopped coming to see me. Troy brought a nurse in, separating us and saying he needed to apply medication. So, I realized my dad had been brought here by Troy. "Troy, can you tell me what my mom said to you back then and last night?" I asked, grasping his hand. I was too naive, thinking that keeping him away from my mom would make things okay. My mom was so calculating. She would never give me a chance to breathe. Troy, with red eyes, held onto the few intact fingers of my hand. "Let me ask you first. Did you think of me when you were hurting yourself?" I was stunned. I did. That's why I was careful and did it on purpose. I had to find an outlet for my emotions, and was also taking a gamble that she might have some feelings for me. Of course, if I lost the gamble, then that's another matter. "Lydia." "Fine." I interrupted him, looking into his eyes with tender affection. "Since you have things you're hiding from me, and I have my own secrets, let's call it even. After all, I love you. What about you?" He looked down for a long time, and when he looked up again, tears were rare in his eyes. He kissed my forehead and said, "Silly, loving you is the longest thing I've ever done." 25. After being my mom's daughter for so many years, I wouldn't expect anything to change. So, it was only natural that my mom didn't come to see me or say a word to me. During my stay, Marissa and her brother Malcolm also came to visit. Malcolm explained to me what Troy had been doing abroad, mostly related to our Chin family's business. When I secretly asked him about what happened 4 years ago, Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Probably what you think. But your mom, her words were really harsh. Instead of feeling hurt, I smiled. It felt like a relief. But Troy's self-esteem wasn't really hurt by her. He's been through so much that your mom's incident wasn't significant. Mainly, he wants to be with you in the future. So even though Marissa sometimes tries to talk to him about your life in the country, he avoids it. He probably feared that I might fall for Grant, and that I might compromise with fate. He had to ask Marissa to take care of you. If anything happened to you, he would come back immediately. Yet you've been pretty impressive, never giving him the chance. Of course, I was impressive. I had been busy over the years, secretly starting my own brand, and participated in an international competition earlier this year. The results were about to be announced. I remembered something. Was the international general agent something you and Troy established together? I blinked. Malcolm, let's collaborate. My mom's skills are outdated. Young people don't like them. But my studio focuses on fashion trends with ethnic characteristics. Although the studio is small, considering our friendship, could you give me a backdoor opportunity? Malcolm's expression changed and he leaned back. You and your in-laws are so alike. He pulled out a contract, which prominently displayed my studio's name. So this was what Troy had been doing all these years. I guessed his original intention was to use this opportunity to gain my mom's approval, to show her that he could provide the life I wanted without relying on the Maxwell family, and to offer her a peaceful old age. If not for this accident, though my hands were immobile, I insisted on signing the contract, forcing Malcolm to give me the pen before Troy returned. I struggled to write my name next to Troy's signature, which had already been completed. When Troy came back, I couldn't control my tears as they fell drop by drop in front of him. Malcolm quickly left. We, the suffering couple, cried together, embracing each other. I bit his shoulder fiercely. This bad guy. He had his best friend by my side without telling me. I would make sure to amend his introverted nature in the future. 26. When Grant learned that Troy was my college boyfriend, he seemed unable to accept it. What he couldn't accept even more was Troy's current identity. During those years when our relationship was at its worst, he often complained to this harmless older brother. Luckily, you were thrown out of the Maxwell family long ago. Otherwise, you would have to bear all of today's consequences. Marrying a woman he doesn't love and living with her under media scrutiny. Damn, I wouldn't even touch her. How could I? It's disgusting. Can't a girl maintain some dignity? Why does she have to cling to someone who doesn't love her? Bro, it would be better if we switched places. Sigh. When Troy left the country, 2 people looked for him. One was my mom. The other was Uncle Maxwell. Uncle Maxwell, who had given him nothing except half of his bloodline, surprisingly offered some assets that had been neglected abroad for years. He said that if things didn't work out, selling these assets could ensure a comfortable life abroad. What my mom said to him I never knew. My Troy, with his pride, understood that a gentleman does not let temporary humiliation damage his spirit. He accepted the assets from Uncle Maxwell and simply said, "Thank you." After he returned, Uncle Maxwell, upon learning that Troy was the real mastermind behind the company, considered replacing Grant and supporting Troy's rise. Whatever decision Troy made, I supported. Just like when I watched his first debate competition and instantly became his fan. My love. Though late, it had finally arrived. Extra chapter Troy. 1. Lydia said she first met me at that freshman debate competition, but that's not true. I first saw her when she was 16 in a hospital. My grandmother had fallen while collecting soybeans drying on the roof. Not only did she fall, but she got caught on the ladder, tearing a large gash in her thigh that looked terrifying, and her leg bone seemed to be broken. My grandfather was away at the bank in town and couldn't return in time, so I took a car alone to bring her to the city hospital. When we arrived, I realized I had forgotten my ID and money. I was frantic that day. A high school girl with long hair bumped into me, and I got blood all over her, but she didn't seem to mind. She got up from the ground, tilted her head and asked, "What's wrong? Why are you crying on the floor?" I said I needed to go back to get money, but there was no one to look after my grandmother. She shook her long hair. pulled out a small note from her pocket with a bank card number written on it, and handed it to me saying, "I have cash. Use this for now. Remember to return the money to this account." I'm Lydia. Wasn't she afraid I might cheat her? I asked her. She giggled and shook her head. I'm not short of money. If you cheat me, so be it. Hurry up and go. Later, she didn't remember me. Of course, she didn't remember, because that day she was at the hospital because her father had brought her there for an eye sty. One eye was covered with a bandage, and the other was so swollen that her eyeball was barely visible. She looked rather comical. Later, when I visited her school for a competition, I saw her class and recognized after a long time that the girl with the flamboyant beauty was Lydia. That was the first time I saw her true face, and I felt like my heart suddenly sank to the dust, as the poem goes. Just that one glance made me think of many things. I almost turned and wanted to escape desperately. It was also on that day that I suddenly witnessed this scene. Her mother came to the school and, after the teacher mentioned she was suspected of early romantic involvement, without asking for any explanation, slapped her in front of the whole class. Did I spend money to send you here to act flirtatious? If you don't love him, get lost and leave the resources to the children in the mountains. I won't listen to any explanations. Apologize and swear there won't be a next time. Not going to say it? Then don't come back. After her mother finished speaking, she turned and walked away. Lydia stood there with red eyes, suddenly breaking down, crying and running after her mother's retreating figure. I stopped in my tracks. My girl shouldn't be treated like this. 2. Lydia's personality was different when she wasn't facing her mom. I carefully nurtured her wildness. In the team, she was treated completely differently from how I treated others. Everyone could see it except her. She chased after me with thoughts that everyone knew, and was just behind me. In the milk tea shop, she saw a note from another girl left for me. Troy, if you see this note and are interested in me, please draw a heart below. I'll come by every day. Love, Ping. Lydia read out each word, and everyone around laughed ambiguously. She was clearly very angry, grabbing the note and trying to crumple it, but then dejectedly letting go and handing it to me. If you want to draw it, then go ahead. Really? What if you don't even know her well? Shouldn't you get to know her first? Her eyes were full of longing, her thoughts visible in her gaze, as she grabbed my pen, not letting me move. I said, "Let go." Her eyes immediately reddened, but she still let go. I wrote on the note, "I have light in my heart and won't look at others." The teammates started to tease, and she alone, holding a cup of milk tea, pondered for a long time. I overheard her muttering, "What does light mean?" 3. The year of graduation, I encountered her mother again. I actually knew that day would eventually come. I wasn't afraid of Ms. Liu. I wanted to experience what my girl had experienced. Nora, gracefully seated across from me, didn't say a harsh word. She just asked about my grandparents with concern. She knew my mom left nothing when she left, and my dad wanted my grandparents to die so he wouldn't have to bear a moral debt. Nora smiled at the end and said to me, "Do you think I would give you money to leave my daughter? My daughter is the most obedient. I have ways to handle things without spending a penny on someone like you. I just wanted to see what kind of fool she wasted so much time on. Now I see. It's not worth it." Before leaving, she said, "I'll cover your coffee bill and send you the travel expenses for your return. It's not easy for you too." That year I was still young. As I left the store, I felt the chill. I smiled but ended up crying. My girl, so it turns out she had been in so much pain every day. 4. Every day abroad, I missed Lydia. I really didn't want to integrate into life abroad or accept their open-minded thinking. I would rather return home, where at least there was her presence. Nora told me that the way they planned to deal with Grant was with Lydia's consent. I didn't know whether to believe it. Deep down I didn't believe it, but my insecurity made me never dare to be sure. But I didn't need to believe anything. I only needed to believe one thing, that I loved her no matter what. Because I loved her, I knew what I needed to do. I threw myself into this completely unfamiliar field with relentless determination. It wasn't entirely unfamiliar. It was all things Lydia liked. Over 4 years of college, I had been influenced by her interests. Every day, I thought that no matter whether she took over the Chin family business or really started her own design studio, I could help her, and in the same industry we would meet again. Until the day she announced her engagement. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to find her, whether she wanted me or not. 5. Perhaps being close to home made me fearful, and wanting it too much made me afraid of losing it even more. With all my courage, I hadn't considered how I would live if she rejected me. I still had my grandparents. Their health was deteriorating and I could use all my earnings to support them, but what about after that? What about after that? Lydia was still Lydia, more flamboyant and beautiful than ever. She had a touch of charm in her purity, stirring my heart, but in reality she didn't need it. She didn't know that every glance, every moment of distraction, I would ponder over for a long time. That was the light that sustained me abroad, the light that kept me going. The most wonderful thing in the world is, after all the trials, the person you thought was lost is also searching for you. 6. Lydia, as if mad, shouted at her mother, scratching herself with shards of porcelain, including that face she loved the most. I understood the pain that erupted in her heart at that moment. She felt her body was original sin. After more than 20 years of her parents' teachings, she couldn't accept being treated like less than human by those closest to her. She also knew that this was useless, just an outlet for her emotions. I held her. She lost her sanity and even scratched my neck and hands. When her sanity returned and she saw me, she calmed down, tears streaming down her face, nestling in my arms, saying, "Troy, I'm sorry." No, I'm the one who is sorry. I had 1,000 reasons to leave, whether forced or voluntary, for growth or for the future, but I still regretted not being by your side during those difficult years. Fortunately, everything will be resolved from now on. As long as we are together, we fear nothing. Lydia's mother would not forgive us. She was strong-willed all her life, and even on the day the Chin family went bankrupt, she remained as proud as ever. She announced to the public that she had no daughter named Lydia and withdrew from the fashion industry with Shimuqiang, then disappeared without a trace. When Lydia saw the news, her eyes turned red, and then she let out a long, deep breath. She said she had been exhausted for years. Suddenly relaxed, she wanted to have a good night's rest. She said that night was the best sleep she had ever had. Don't worry. In the years to come, I will slowly heal her. After all, she is my one true love.